You deserve this disease. My son humiliated his stepmother with cancer, so I taught him a lesson. This is a story about family, love, and life lessons, about how a man's virtues and his love for his wife can be tested, sometimes by those we least expect. Before you watch this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to our channel, and let us know in the comments where you're listening to this beautiful story from. Walter Thompson was 70 years old, a man whose life had been marked by both deep love and devastating loss. He had spent over 4 decades with his late wife, Margaret, building a life filled with shared dreams, family traditions, and warm memories. When she passed away more than 10 years ago, it left a hole in his heart that nothing seemed able to fill. For years, Walter lived quietly, tending to his small garden, visiting the local diner every Thursday, and finding comfort in the routines that reminded him of her. But loneliness has a way of creeping in, no matter how full a life once was. Everything began to change when Walter met Linda Parker at a community charity event. Linda was 65, graceful, with kind hazel eyes that carried both warmth and wisdom. She wasn't flashy or loud, just genuinely present in a way that made Walter feel seen again. She listened when he spoke, laughed at his old jokes, and shared stories that reminded him that life could still hold surprises. Over coffee and small walks in the park, their connection deepened into something neither of them expected at their age. Linda wasn't just a partner. She became Walter's confidant, his daily source of joy. She encouraged him to travel again, to try new recipes, even to take dance classes for the first time in his life. Her presence softened the edges of his grief, giving him back a sense of purpose. Walter found himself waking up with excitement again, not just going through the motions. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was moving forward, not just existing in the shadow of the past. Yet despite their happiness, there was one cloud that hung over their relationship: Walter's son, Jason. At 38, Jason had never truly accepted Linda. From the moment they were introduced, Jason's tone was cool, his handshake brief. He saw Linda not as someone who cared for his father, but as an intruder in a space he believed belonged only to his late mother's memory. Walter tried to explain that Linda wasn't replacing anyone, but Jason seemed unwilling to listen. Jason's rejection wasn't subtle. At family gatherings, he would avoid sitting near Linda, sometimes not even acknowledging her presence. When Walter spoke fondly of her, Jason's jaw would tighten, and he would change the subject. It hurt Walter deeply, but he hoped, naively perhaps, that time would soften Jason's stance. After all, wasn't compassion supposed to grow as people matured? Still, Walter didn't allow Jason's coldness to dictate the terms of his happiness. He and Linda traveled, celebrated small victories, and hosted friends at home. Linda never complained about Jason's behavior, though Walter could see the sadness in her eyes after each strained encounter. She was patient, believing that kindness and consistency would eventually break down his walls. Walter admired her strength, even if he sometimes worried that Jason's bitterness would never fade. Looking back, Walter would later realize that the tension with Jason was not just a background issue. It was the quiet fuse leading toward an explosion he never saw coming. At that moment, though, all he wanted was to cherish the life he had found again. Little did he know, the bond he shared with Linda would soon be tested in ways that would reveal not only Jason's true character, but also Walter's own capacity for tough love. From the very first introduction, Jason's demeanor toward Linda was like a winter wind, sharp, biting, and impossible to ignore. She had extended her hand with a warm smile that day, hoping to make a good impression, but Jason's grip had been loose, and his eyes had wandered past her as if she were an inconvenience. He didn't yell, didn't openly insult her, but the absence of kindness was just as loud as any shouted insult. Linda, ever the optimist, assumed it was just awkwardness and that things would improve with time. They didn't. If anything, Jason's behavior became more calculated. At dinners, he would direct all questions to Walter, never once asking Linda about her day or her life. When she tried to share a funny story, he would glance at his phone or sip his drink as if she weren't even speaking. There was an art to his rudeness, subtle enough to avoid open confrontation, but obvious enough to wound. Walter noticed every slight, though he often chose to remain silent for the sake of peace. Sometimes Jason's coldness came in the form of backhanded remarks. "I'm sure Dad's happy. For now," he would say, smirking, when friends asked about Walter's relationship. Or, "It's good you have company, Dad. Must make the house feel less empty," with a tone that suggested Linda was just filling a void rather than bringing real joy. Linda would smile politely, but Walter could see the way her shoulders stiffened each time. Walter tried to bridge the gap, inviting Jason to join them for casual lunches, suggesting small family outings where they could bond. Each time, Jason found an excuse. Busy with work, not feeling well, another commitment. When Walter pressed, Jason would sigh dramatically and say, "Dad, I just don't feel like playing happy families with a stranger." The words cut deep, not only for Linda but for Walter too. Still, Walter kept hoping. He told himself that grief worked in strange ways, that perhaps Jason saw Linda as a threat to his mother's memory. "Give it time," Walter would say to Linda in quiet moments. "He'll see how wonderful you are." Linda nodded, though Walter sometimes caught a flicker of doubt in her eyes. She was patient, but patience has limits, especially when kindness is met with frost. Over the months, Linda continued trying. She baked cookies and sent them to Jason's apartment. She asked about his job. She even bought a thoughtful gift for his birthday. Each gesture was met with minimal acknowledgement, a curt thanks, or worse, no reply at all. Walter's heart ached watching her efforts dissolve into silence. He wanted to defend her, to call Jason out, but part of him feared that forcing the issue would only widen the rift. It would have been easy for Walter to give up, to separate his time between his son and the woman he loved, keeping their worlds apart. But he didn't want that. He dreamed of shared holidays, Sunday dinners with laughter around the table, maybe even the possibility of Jason seeing Linda as family. Unfortunately, what Walter didn't realize was that Jason's coldness wasn't just stubbornness. It was the seed of something far more cruel, something that would soon surface in a moment neither of them could ever forget. It started as a dull ache in Linda's side, something she brushed off as fatigue or maybe a lingering flu. She kept moving through her days, cooking, gardening, and reading by the window, but Walter noticed the winces she tried to hide. "You okay, sweetheart?" he asked more than once, but she always waved it off. Then one night the pain was so sharp it brought tears to her eyes. Walter insisted on taking her to the doctor the next morning. She protested, but his voice was firm. There would be no more waiting. The first round of tests led to more tests, then scans, then a quiet, tense wait that stretched into weeks. Walter stayed by her side at every appointment, holding her hand in waiting rooms that smelled faintly of antiseptic and fear. Linda smiled faintly, trying to keep things light, but Walter could see the weight pressing on her. Deep down, they both knew something wasn't right. When the doctor finally called them into his office, the air seemed heavier than usual. "Linda, I'm afraid it's cancer," the doctor said gently. The word seemed to echo, bouncing off the walls and slamming into Walter's chest. He felt his grip on her hand tighten instinctively, as if he could anchor her through the shock. Linda nodded slowly, her eyes steady, but Walter could see the shimmer of unshed tears. They listened as the doctor outlined treatment options: surgery, chemotherapy, possible radiation. It all sounded like a foreign language spoken in a place where hope felt dangerously fragile. The drive home was silent. Walter's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his mind a storm of fear, anger, and determination. He glanced at Linda, who stared out the window, the fading afternoon light brushing across her face. "We'll get through this," he finally said, his voice rough but certain. "I'll be with you every step of the way." Linda turned to him, managing a small smile, and whispered, "I know." That night, Walter sat alone in the kitchen long after Linda went to bed. He thought of all they had shared in the past years, the laughter, the quiet mornings, the small kindnesses that had rebuilt his heart after years of loneliness. The idea of losing her felt unbearable, but more than anything, he vowed to make sure she never felt alone in this fight. In his heart, Walter hoped that the news would bridge the gap with Jason. Surely, faced with something so serious, his son would put aside old grudges. He imagined Jason calling to check in, maybe even stopping by to offer help. Walter clung to that hope, telling himself that family had a way of coming together in times like these. But hope can be fragile. And in Jason's case, Walter would soon learn that compassion was not guaranteed, that sometimes even the gravest news can bring out the worst in people. Walter wanted to believe that food could bring people together. It always had in his home when he was younger, Sunday roasts, birthday cakes, holiday dinners. So he decided to host a family lunch, hoping it might soften the tension between Jason and Linda. The plan was simple: good food, a warm atmosphere, and maybe a chance for Jason to see the kindness in her eyes. Linda, despite feeling weak from her first treatments, insisted on baking her famous apple pie, the one that filled the kitchen with the smell of cinnamon and nostalgia. On the morning of the lunch, Walter helped her peel the apples. She moved slower than usual, pausing every so often to catch her breath, but she smiled through it. "I want this to feel normal," she told him. Walter kissed her forehead, grateful for her determination. The house filled with the comforting scent of roasting chicken, fresh bread, and that golden pie cooling on the counter. Everything was set for what Walter hoped would be a turning point. Jason, however, was late. Walter checked his watch more than once, trying to keep his frustration at bay. Linda brushed it off, saying, "Maybe traffic's bad." But Walter knew his son well enough to recognize the pattern. Being late was Jason's way of showing he didn't care. When Jason finally arrived, he pushed the door open without knocking and stepped inside as if it were an inconvenience to be there at all. Walter rose to greet him, smiling in spite of the coldness in Jason's eyes. "Good to see you, son," he said. Jason gave a brief nod to his father, but didn't so much as glance at Linda, who stood nearby with a gentle smile. She murmured, "Hello, Jason," in a soft, hopeful tone. Jason ignored her completely, brushing past her to drop his coat on the back of a chair. Walter felt a pang of anger, but he swallowed it. Today was supposed to be about harmony. They all sat down, and Walter tried to keep the conversation light, talking about the weather, old family memories, and even a bit of local news. Linda served Jason a generous portion, her hands trembling slightly from fatigue, but he didn't thank her. Instead, he stabbed his fork into the chicken and began eating without a word. Walter noticed the tightness in Linda's jaw, the way she blinked more often than usual to hold back emotion. As the meal went on, Jason spoke almost exclusively to Walter, discussing his work and a new car he had his eye on. Whenever Linda tried to join the conversation, Jason's responses were curt, sometimes no more than a single word. Walter felt the weight of the silence between them, an invisible wall that no amount of apple pie could break. He glanced at Linda, who kept her composure, but her eyes told a different story, one of quiet hurt. When dessert was finally served, Linda placed the pie in front of Jason with a hopeful smile. "It's the one you used to love," she said gently. Jason looked at it, shrugged, and muttered, "I'm not really into sweets anymore." The dismissal was like a slap in the face, and Walter felt his patience thinning. He had wanted this lunch to heal wounds, but instead it was only deepening the cracks. The conversation had been strained from the moment Jason sat down, but Walter kept trying to steer it towards something warmer. Between bites of chicken, he spoke about Linda's courage during her treatments, about how she never complained, even on the hardest days. "She's been incredibly strong," Walter said, his voice full of pride. "I don't know how I would have managed without her," he thought. Maybe if Jason heard that, it would spark a shred of compassion. Jason's fork paused mid-air. His eyes flicked to Linda for just a moment, sharp, cold, and utterly devoid of warmth. Then, with a tone that was almost casual, he said the words Walter would never forget. "You deserve this disease." The sentence landed like a physical blow. For a heartbeat, the room went utterly still. No clinking of silverware, no murmured conversation, just a heavy silence. Walter's chest tightened. He could hardly process what he'd just heard. Linda, sitting directly across from Jason, froze. Her eyes widened slightly, then quickly darted down to her plate. She didn't want him to see the tears that were beginning to form. She gripped her fork with trembling fingers, but her appetite had vanished. The apple pie sat untouched, its sweet aroma suddenly turning bitter in the air. The silence was deafening. Walter's mind raced, torn between an urge to shout and a desperate need to keep the peace. He could feel the blood rising in his face. "Jason," he began, but his voice cracked. Jason just leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable, as if he hadn't just said something that cut to the bone. Linda swallowed hard, trying to compose herself. She took a small sip of water, her hands shaking so much she nearly spilled it. She managed a faint, forced smile, an instinct she had learned after years of facing difficult people. But it faded quickly. She pushed her plate away, her appetite gone. Walter saw her knuckles turning white as she clutched the edge of the table. Inside, Walter felt something break. This was no longer about misunderstanding or stubbornness. This was cruelty, cold, deliberate cruelty. He had hoped time and kindness could bridge the gap between his wife and his son, but Jason's words were proof that the gap had become a chasm. Walter realized that unless something changed, it would swallow their family whole. The rest of the meal passed in fragments of meaningless chatter, mostly from Walter, who tried desperately to change the subject. But the weight of Jason's words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Linda spoke very little, her voice quiet and distant. Jason, on the other hand, ate leisurely, as if nothing had happened, oblivious, or perhaps indifferent to the wound he had just inflicted. Walter sat frozen in his chair, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. The sting of Jason's words echoed in his mind, repeating like a cruel refrain. He had endured many disappointments as a father, but this was something darker. It wasn't just disrespect. It was a deliberate attempt to wound. He could see Linda's shoulders slightly hunched, her body curling in on itself as if to shield from an invisible blow. That image seared into Walter's heart. He had always been a man who believed in second chances, in patience, in letting time work its quiet magic to soften bitterness. For years, he had defended Jason's behavior, telling himself it was just immaturity, that one day his son would realize the value of kindness. But as he looked at Jason now, calmly sipping his drink, no sign of remorse, Walter realized that patience had only given his son more room to grow crueler. The ache in his chest wasn't only anger, it was grief. Grief for the boy he once held in his arms, the child who used to run to him after school with pockets full of marbles and questions about the world. That boy was gone, replaced by a man whose pride had calcified into something poisonous. Walter understood something important in that moment. Protecting Jason from consequences had been his biggest mistake. He glanced at Linda, who was still silent. Her fork rested on the edge of her plate, untouched. Her eyes remained fixed downward, but Walter could see the faint shimmer of tears gathering. She didn't deserve this, not after everything she had done to make their home warm again. She had been nothing but kind, even in the face of Jason's constant rejection. The thought of her going through cancer treatments while also enduring this cruelty filled Walter with a quiet rage. In that rage, something inside him shifted. He realized this was a turning point, not only for Jason, but for himself. He could no longer play the role of the peacekeeper, cushioning his son from the weight of his own actions. This time, there would be no excuses, no gentle lectures, no quietly sweeping things under the rug. Jason needed to understand deeply, unmistakably, that words have power and cruelty has a cost. Walter's mind began to race, the outlines of a plan forming before the meal was even over. He knew Jason valued appearances and money above all else. He also knew his son depended on him in ways Jason liked to pretend he didn't. Over the years, Walter had bailed him out of financial messes, co-signed loans, and even helped him buy his first house. Jason had always assumed his father's support was an endless resource. That assumption was about to shatter. As he chewed his final bite in silence, Walter thought about the perfect way to make Jason face the reality of his own actions. It had to be something that wouldn't just punish him, but force him to see the pain he'd caused, to truly feel the weight of his cruelty toward Linda. He wouldn't shout or throw accusations. The lesson would come quietly, but it would land with the force of a hammer. Jason, oblivious to the storm building in his father's mind, leaned back and scrolled through his phone, chuckling at something on the screen. That sight only strengthened Walter's resolve. His son's arrogance was a mask he wore to shield himself from accountability. Walter decided that mask was coming off, soon, and in a way, Jason wouldn't forget. The table was cleared in tense silence. Linda excused herself early, saying she needed to rest. Walter kissed her forehead gently and promised he would join her soon. But inside, he wasn't just thinking about tucking her in for the night. He was thinking about the steps he would take over the coming days to ensure that Jason's cruelty had real, tangible consequences. As Jason left that afternoon, tossing a casual "see you, Dad" over his shoulder, Walter knew their relationship was about to change forever. The son who had believed himself untouchable was about to learn that there are lines you do not cross, and when you do, the world has a way of teaching you humility. And Walter intended to be the one holding the chalk. Walter lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling while the shadows shifted across his bedroom walls. The scene from the lunch replayed in his mind over and over. Jason's cold eyes, Linda's quiet pain, the heavy silence that followed. But now, mixed with the ache, there was clarity. He finally knew exactly how he would teach his son the lesson life had been trying to deliver for years. And fate, it seemed, had already handed him the perfect tool. Just a week earlier, Jason had called, excited about his big break. He was planning to open a high-end sports bar with a friend, a place he insisted would make them both rich in no time. The only thing standing in his way was the bank loan. The bank was ready to approve it, if Jason had a co-signer. Walter had agreed without hesitation at the time, thinking it was an opportunity to support his son's ambitions. But now, that promise felt like an open door to something far more important. He remembered the smug certainty in Jason's voice when he explained the business plan. Jason had spoken as if success was inevitable, as if his father's role was merely to sign a piece of paper and then sit back while Jason took all the glory. But Walter also knew the truth. Without his signature, the deal would fall apart instantly. That single fact gave him more leverage than he'd ever had with his son. Walter wasn't planning to humiliate Jason in public or destroy his dreams completely. That wasn't the point. The goal was to make him stop and see, really see, how his actions hurt others, to make him feel what Linda felt when those venomous words left his mouth. Jason's business dream was more than just a financial venture. It was his pride, his identity. Losing it, or even thinking he might lose it, would force him to confront the reality that he could not treat people like they were disposable and still expect their loyalty. The next morning, Walter sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee as Linda slept upstairs. He began drafting a letter, not to the bank, but to Jason. It wouldn't be filled with accusations or angry tirades. Instead, it would be a simple, direct statement. Before Walter signed anything, Jason needed to make things right with Linda. Not in passing, not with a half-hearted sorry, but with genuine effort and sincerity. Walter would make it clear that until that happened, the co-signer line would remain blank. As he wrote, Walter felt a strange calm wash over him. For years, he had reacted to Jason's cruelty with wounded silence or clumsy attempts to reason. This was different. This was deliberate. It was a quiet kind of justice, not revenge for revenge's sake, but a way to draw a line in the sand. He wanted Jason to understand that the privilege of his father's support came with the responsibility of respect, especially toward the woman who had stood by Walter's side in sickness and in health. By the time Linda came downstairs, Walter had folded the letter neatly and placed it in an envelope. He didn't mention it to her. This was something she didn't need to carry. When the moment came, Jason would receive the message, and Walter would be ready to watch his son's pride collide with the truth. It was the beginning of a lesson that would change everything between them. The day of the bank meeting dawned bright and clear, but Walter's mood was anything but light. He dressed carefully, wearing his best jacket, the one Linda always said made him look distinguished. When he arrived at the bank, Jason was already there, pacing in the lobby with a wide grin on his face. He greeted Walter with a quick handshake, barely making eye contact, as if the formalities of seeing his father were just a minor step toward the real business of the day. As they walked toward the office where the loan officer was waiting, Jason launched into an enthusiastic monologue about the future. He spoke of franchise opportunities, celebrity endorsements, and a 5-year plan that would make them millionaires. Walter nodded occasionally, letting him talk, keeping his own thoughts guarded. The contrast between his son's excitement and the memory of Linda's quiet hurt at the lunch table was jarring. Jason barely paused to breathe. "We'll start with one location, but trust me, Dad, this is going to take off fast. You'll be glad you backed me up. This is our legacy." Walter felt the words twist in his chest. Our legacy. Jason's idea of legacy didn't seem to include kindness, empathy, or the people who stood beside you when life got hard. Inside the office, the bank representative greeted them warmly, laying out the stack of documents. Jason reached for the pen almost instantly, ready to sign his part. He glanced at Walter with a confident smirk, certain his father would simply follow suit. Walter kept his hands folded in his lap, his expression calm but unreadable. As the conversation turned to the co-signer section, the loan officer slid the page toward Walter. Jason leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers impatiently. "Go ahead, Dad," he said, as if this were nothing more than a formality. But Walter didn't move. Instead, he slowly took the folded envelope from his jacket pocket and placed it on the table, sliding it toward his son. Jason frowned, confused. "What's this?" he asked, picking up the envelope. "Just read it," Walter said quietly, his voice steady. Jason hesitated, then tore it open. His eyes scanned the neat handwriting, and with each passing second, the confident smirk faded from his face. His jaw tightened. "Are you kidding me?" he muttered. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. Walter didn't raise his voice. "I told you I'd help you, Jason. And I will, on one condition. You owe Linda an apology, a real one. You made her feel worthless in her own home. I won't put my name on anything until you make this right." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioner. Jason's eyes darted between the page and his father's face, his pride warring with his need for the loan. Walter stayed still, his gaze steady. This was no bluff, and Jason knew it. The first crack in his arrogance had appeared, and Walter was ready to push just enough to let the light in. Jason froze, pen in hand, his confident expression collapsing into confusion. For a moment, he thought he had misheard his father. "What do you mean you can't support me?" he asked, his voice a mix of irritation and disbelief. Walter leaned forward slightly, meeting his son's eyes without flinching. "I can't support a man who has no compassion," he said, each word deliberate, heavy, and impossible to ignore. Jason scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "Oh, come on, Dad. This isn't about compassion. This is business. You've been saying you want me to succeed for years. Well, here's your chance to make that happen." Walter shook his head slowly. "Success without humanity isn't worth a thing. If you can't treat people with basic decency, especially those who've done nothing but care for you, then I won't help you build anything." The loan officer shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension but wisely staying silent. Jason's voice rose slightly. "Is this about Linda again? She's not my mother, Dad. I don't owe her anything." Walter's expression darkened. "You owe every human being kindness, Jason, and you owe her respect for what she means to me. The fact that you can't see that, well, that tells me more about your character than I ever wanted to know." Jason's fingers drummed on the table, his frustration mounting. "So what? You're going to throw away my future over a stupid argument?" Walter's reply came instantly. "This isn't about an argument. It's about the kind of man you're choosing to be. Right now, you're not someone I can stand beside." His tone wasn't angry, just deeply disappointed, and that hurt Jason more than he expected. For a few seconds, the room was silent, except for Jason's shallow breathing. He glanced at the loan papers, the opportunity slipping through his fingers, and then back at his father. "You'd really let me fail?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost uncertain. Walter didn't look away. "I'd rather let you fail in business than let you fail as a human being." Jason's jaw clenched, and for the first time, a flicker of vulnerability crossed his face. He looked away, staring at the floor, his pride battling against a truth he didn't want to admit. Walter kept his eyes on him, letting the weight of the moment settle. He knew this was a turning point. Either Jason would dig deeper into his arrogance or take the first step towards something better. Finally, Jason exhaled sharply and pushed the papers back toward the loan officer. "Fine," he muttered. "If this is how it's going to be, then I guess I have nothing else to say." Walter didn't respond. The meeting was over, but the lesson had only just begun. Walter sat back in his chair, his voice calm but unwavering. "Jason, money can build a house, but it can't build character. I've spent my life trying to teach you integrity, and I won't watch you throw that away for pride." Jason stared at him, his jaw tight, hands curling into fists on the table. "So this is it? You're really choosing her over your own son?" Walter shook his head. "No, I'm choosing what's right over what's wrong." Jason let out a bitter laugh. "You think you're some kind of moral hero, but all you're doing is abandoning me." Walter leaned forward, his tone sharper now. "Abandoning you would be pretending your behavior is acceptable. I won't do that. Until you can respect the woman I love, you won't have my support. Not in business, not financially, not in anything." The words landed like a gavel hitting the bench, final and absolute. The loan officer glanced nervously between them, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. Jason's face turned red, a mix of embarrassment and anger boiling over. "You'll regret this," he spat, shoving his chair back so hard it scraped loudly against the floor. Walter didn't flinch. "Maybe," he said quietly. "But I'd regret it far more if I helped you become a man without empathy." Jason grabbed his coat in one jerky motion, glaring at his father as if daring him to take it back. Walter remained silent, his expression steady but heavy with disappointment. That silence cut deeper than any argument. They both knew it. Jason opened his mouth as if to speak, but nothing came out. The air between them was thick with everything unsaid. Then, without another word, Jason stormed toward the exit. The door slammed behind him with a force that made the glass rattle in its frame. The loan officer let out a slow breath, breaking the tension. Walter stayed seated, staring at the empty chair his son had left behind. It felt like more than just a business meeting had ended. It was the severing of a rope Walter had been holding onto for years. He thought about Linda, about her quiet strength even in the face of illness, about the way she had tried, time and again, to make peace with Jason. Walter knew she didn't deserve the cruelty she had received, and if this was the price to finally make Jason confront his own flaws, then so be it. His heart ached, but there was a certain clarity in the pain. Walter rose slowly, gathered his things, and walked out of the bank into the afternoon sun. Each step felt heavy but purposeful. He had drawn a line that couldn't be erased. Whether Jason crossed it someday or not, that was entirely up to him. Walter left the bank with a sense of both loss and resolve. He had cut his son off in a way he never imagined he would, but he knew deep down it was the right choice. Instead of letting the money sit idle, he began thinking about what could be done with it, something that truly mattered. That night, as Linda rested on the couch, wrapped in her favorite quilt, Walter sat at the dining table, laptop open, searching for cancer treatment options beyond what their insurance covered. He stumbled upon a clinic known for an innovative therapy, one with promising results for patients like Linda. The cost was high, very high, but Walter didn't flinch. This was the woman who had brought light back into his life after years of darkness. This was the woman who had stood beside him, never asking for more than his companionship. If Jason had chosen selfishness and cruelty, then Walter would choose compassion and love in the most tangible way possible. He printed the clinic's brochure, the glossy pages filled with words like hope, breakthrough, and healing, words he desperately wanted to believe in. The next morning, Walter called the clinic. A warm-voiced nurse named Claire explained the program in detail, the technology, the schedule, the recovery process. Walter listened carefully, jotting notes. "There's one more thing," Claire said softly. "The sooner we begin, the better her chances." Walter didn't hesitate. "Then we begin as soon as possible. Send me the paperwork. I'll cover the full cost up front." His voice was steady, but inside he felt an urgent rush. Every moment counted now. When Linda awoke, she found Walter in the kitchen, making her tea just the way she liked it, strong, with a spoonful of honey. "You're in a good mood today," she teased, noticing the faint smile on his face. Walter sat beside her, holding her hand. "I have some news," he said gently. "I've found a treatment, one that could give us more time together." Her eyes widened, but before she could speak, he added, "It's already paid for." Linda's first instinct was to protest. "Walter, that must cost a fortune. You can't." But he cut her off with a soft shake of his head. "I can, and I have. That money was meant for something else, but now I know exactly where it belongs. Here, with you." She blinked rapidly, trying to hold back tears. She had never asked him for anything, yet here he was, making the biggest gesture anyone had ever made for her. They spent the afternoon reading through the treatment details together. Linda's hands trembled slightly as she held the papers, but Walter's presence was a steady anchor. "Do you believe this will help?" she asked quietly. Walter looked at her with complete certainty. "I believe in you, and I believe in doing everything possible to fight." He didn't need to say more. She understood. In the days that followed, Walter arranged everything: travel, accommodations near the clinic, and even a schedule for her follow-up care. Friends and neighbors offered to help, but Walter insisted on being there for every appointment. It wasn't just about the treatment, it was about showing Linda that she wasn't alone for a single second of this fight. He wanted her to feel supported in a way Jason had refused to offer. On the first day at the clinic, Linda was nervous, but Walter held her hand through every step. The staff greeted them warmly, already aware of how much Walter had invested, not just financially, but emotionally. As the treatment began, Walter sat nearby, reading, occasionally glancing up just to see her breathing steadily. Each time she met his gaze, he smiled, silently telling her, "We're in this together." Weeks passed, and Linda began to regain some strength. The color returned to her cheeks. Her laughter came more often, and for the first time in months, Walter allowed himself to hope for a future that wasn't defined by illness. The decision to redirect the money had become one of the most meaningful choices of his life. He never once thought about the business Jason had wanted to start. It felt irrelevant compared to what he was watching unfold. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Linda leaned her head on his shoulder. "You've given me more than time, Walter," she whispered. "You've given me peace." He kissed the top of her head, his eyes fixed on the horizon. In that quiet moment, he knew he had no regrets. Not about the money, not about the choice, and certainly not about drawing the line with his son. Some investments paid back in profit, this one paid back in love. In the weeks that followed the confrontation at the bank, Jason vanished from Walter's life. No calls, no visits, not even a curt text message. At first, Walter felt the sting of his absence more than he cared to admit. He found himself glancing at his phone in quiet moments, half expecting to see Jason's name flash on the screen. But each day passed without a word, and the silence became its own answer. This was Jason's way of punishing him, through distance and indifference. Walter tried not to dwell on it. He focused instead on Linda's treatment, on being present for her during every exhausting session. He filled his days with small acts of care, driving her to the clinic, preparing her meals, reading to her in the evenings. Each smile she gave him was a reminder that he had made the right choice. Still, there were nights when he lay awake, replaying Jason's cruel words at the family lunch. They echoed in the darkness, a reminder of the gap between father and son. Linda noticed the change in him. She had a quiet way of reading Walter's moods, even when he tried to hide them. One evening, she placed her hand on his and said softly, "He's angry now, but maybe one day he'll understand." Walter met her gaze and forced a smile. "Maybe," he replied, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. In his heart, he knew Jason's pride ran deep, and compassion had never been his strongest trait. Despite Jason's absence, Walter refused to let bitterness take root. He had lived long enough to know that resentment was a poison you drank yourself. So he poured his energy into love, the kind that asked for nothing in return. When Linda's hair began to thin from the treatment, Walter bought her a beautiful scarf in her favorite shade of deep blue. "You look radiant," he told her, meaning every word. In those moments, Jason's absence felt smaller, almost insignificant, yet the silence carried a certain weight. Holidays came and went without so much as a card from Jason. Friends would ask casually, "How's your son?" And Walter would answer politely, changing the subject quickly. He didn't want to air his pain, nor did he want pity. Linda's presence filled much of the space Jason had left empty, but a part of him still hoped for reconciliation. That hope, though fragile, refused to die completely. Linda's gratitude grew with each passing day. She often told Walter, "You've given me more than care. You've given me dignity." He brushed off the praise, but her words stayed with him. She had been through enough hardship in her life. She deserved to be loved without condition. And so, while Jason's silence lingered like a shadow, Linda's voice was a constant light. Walter clung to that light, letting it guide him forward. By the end of the month, Walter had stopped counting the days since he last heard from his son. He no longer waited for the phone to ring. Instead, he measured time in Linda's progress, in the laughter they shared over morning coffee, in the simple joy of watching the sun set together. Jason might have chosen distance, but Walter had chosen love, and that, he decided, was the better choice. Jason's business dreams had begun to unravel faster than he ever imagined. What once felt like a guaranteed success now felt like a sinking ship. Clients were pulling out, debts were piling up, and the reality of his financial situation loomed like a storm cloud. Alone in his apartment, he stared at the stack of overdue bills on his kitchen counter. For the first time in months, he thought about his father, not with anger, but with a deep, uncomfortable ache. Pride had always been Jason's armor, shielding him from admitting mistakes. But that same pride had cost him dearly. His father's support, his family's warmth, and perhaps even his own happiness. In quiet moments, he replayed the day at the bank in his mind. The disappointment in Walter's eyes haunted him more than he wanted to admit. Those words, "I can't support a man who has no compassion," echoed in his memory, cutting deeper now than they had back then. Nights grew longer, and Jason's thoughts became heavier. He began to question the path he had chosen, the bitterness he had clung to. He realized that his anger toward Linda was never truly about her. It was about his inability to accept change after his mother's passing. She had stepped into a space he had never wanted anyone to fill, and instead of trying to know her, he had built walls. Now, those walls felt like a prison of his own making. One rainy evening, Jason scrolled aimlessly through his phone and came across an old family photo, him as a boy, sitting on Walter's shoulders, both of them laughing. His chest tightened. It had been years since he had felt that kind of closeness with his father. Somewhere along the way, ambition and resentment had replaced love and gratitude. The thought hit him hard. If something happened to Walter, he might never get the chance to fix things. Over the next few days, Jason found himself hesitating before calling. He rehearsed what he might say, but always stopped short of dialing. Apologies were not easy for him. They felt like defeat. And yet, a small voice inside told him that perhaps admitting fault wasn't weakness, but strength. That maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong all along. His financial troubles only amplified the urgency. He wasn't just losing his business, he was losing himself. The thought of going to his father for help again felt almost unbearable. But this time, it wasn't just about money. It was about something much bigger. He wanted to feel like a son again. He wanted to rebuild what he had broken, even if he didn't know how to start. By the end of the week, Jason made a decision. He didn't know if Walter would answer or if he'd even want to see him. But he knew he couldn't keep living with the weight of their estrangement. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of humility, a readiness to face the consequences of his own actions. And with that, he picked up the phone, staring at his father's number, gathering the courage to press call. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when Walter heard a hesitant knock at the door. He wasn't expecting anyone, and Linda was resting in the living room with a blanket over her legs. Walter opened the door and froze. There stood Jason, his hair disheveled, his eyes red, as if he hadn't slept in days. He looked smaller somehow, not in stature, but in spirit. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy. "Dad, can I come in?" Jason's voice cracked, betraying the walls of pride he had once kept so high. Walter stepped aside without a word, though his eyes searched his son's face for the truth. Jason walked in slowly, glancing toward the couch where Linda sat. She didn't move, her hands tightening on the edge of her blanket. Jason swallowed hard, his voice trembling. I was cruel. I said things no decent person should ever say. I told myself I was protecting Mom's memory, but the truth is, I was protecting my own selfish anger. His gaze shifted to Linda. What I said to you was unforgivable. You didn't deserve that. You never did. His words seemed to hang in the air, fragile and raw. Linda's eyes softened, though she didn't speak. She simply looked at him, searching for sincerity. Jason took a step closer, his hands shaking slightly. I can't change what I said or erase the hurt I caused, but I need you to know I'm sorry. Not because I feel guilty, though I do, but because I finally understand how much pain I've caused you both. His voice broke, and tears spilled down his cheeks. For years, Jason had carried himself with an unshakable confidence. But here he was, stripped of it, standing vulnerable before them. Walter felt a tightness in his chest, a mixture of sadness and relief. It had taken so long for this moment to arrive, and yet it was finally here. Linda's lips trembled as she spoke for the first time. Jason, words can hurt more than anything, but sometimes so can silence. I'm glad you came today. Her voice was soft, almost breaking, but there was a trace of warmth in it. Jason nodded, wiping his face, unable to meet her eyes for long. Walter placed a hand on his son's shoulder. An apology doesn't erase the past, he said gently, but it can be the first step toward building something new. Jason looked up at him, hope flickering faintly in his tear-stained expression. And for the first time in years, Walter allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, his son was ready to change. The sun streamed through the hospital blinds as Walter and Linda sat side by side, their hands intertwined. It had been months of hospital visits, sleepless nights, and moments of fear that seemed endless. Today, however, was different. Dr. Harris walked in with a smile that spoke volumes before he even opened his mouth. "Linda," he said warmly, "your scans are clear. You're officially in remission." The words hung in the air like a blessing. Walter felt tears welling up, while Linda simply closed her eyes, letting the relief wash over her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Walter kissed her hand softly, his voice trembling. "We made it, sweetheart. We made it." Linda's eyes glistened, not just from joy, but from the memories of everything they had endured together. She thought of the chemo sessions, the fatigue, the pain, but also the way Walter had been there for her, every single step of the way. It was a victory not just over illness, but over every obstacle life had thrown their way. They walked out of the hospital that day with lighter steps, the air somehow feeling fresher. Walter, for the first time in months, didn't feel the weight of fear pressing on his chest. As they reached the car, he turned to Linda with a grin that reminded her of the young man she had first met. "Pack your bags," he said. "We're going to the beach." Linda laughed, a sound that felt like music after so many heavy days. For years, a beach trip had been their shared dream, always postponed, always waiting for the right time. But now, with the shadow of illness lifted, they knew the right time was now. Walter booked a small but beautiful seaside cottage, just steps away from the shore. As they drove along the coast, the salty breeze drifted through the open windows, and Linda leaned her head against Walter's shoulder. When they arrived, the view stole Linda's breath. The horizon stretched endlessly, the waves rolling in with a rhythm that seemed to say, "You're alive, live." They dropped their bags inside and walked barefoot toward the water. The sand was warm beneath their feet, and the ocean's cool spray kissed their ankles. Walter looked at her with a playful smile. "Race you to the water." She laughed again, the kind of laugh that makes the world brighter. That night, they sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket together, watching the sun sink into the horizon. Walter opened a bottle of wine and poured 2 glasses. "To you," he said, raising his glass. "To us," Linda corrected gently, clinking hers against his. They sipped slowly, savoring not just the taste, but the moment. It was the kind of peace they had both longed for and fought so hard to earn. In the days that followed, they walked along the beach every morning, collecting seashells and talking about everything and nothing. Linda felt her strength returning, not just physically, but in spirit. Each sunrise seemed to promise more life, more love, more days like this. Walter watched her closely, grateful for every smile, every step, every moment that reminded him of how close he had come to losing her. One afternoon, they sat on a blanket with a picnic spread before them. "I can't believe I almost didn't get to have this," Linda said softly, looking out at the sea. Walter squeezed her hand. "That's why we're not wasting a single day," he replied. She nodded, knowing he meant it. Life felt more fragile now, but also infinitely more precious. On their last evening, they lit a small fire on the beach and watched the stars appear one by one. Walter pulled her close, feeling her heartbeat against his chest. "You know," he whispered, "this isn't just your victory. It's ours. We fought together." Linda smiled against his shoulder, knowing he was right. They had both been changed by this journey, stronger, closer, more certain of what truly mattered. As the waves whispered their eternal lullaby, Walter made a silent promise to never let life's smaller worries cloud what they had now. Linda, with her head resting on him, felt the same. The battle had been long, the scars were real, but they had come out the other side together. And that was the greatest victory of all. Walter sat on the porch, watching the late afternoon sun cast golden streaks over the yard. The beach trip with Linda was now a cherished memory, tucked alongside so many moments of love and perseverance. But his mind was on Jason. The last time they had spoken, anger had filled the space between them. Now, Walter wondered if his son had truly understood the lesson, not about money, but about life, compassion, and respect. He sipped his tea, feeling the cool breeze, when he heard footsteps approaching the gate. Jason stood there, a little thinner, his expression softer than Walter had ever seen. He no longer had the swagger of a man convinced the world owed him something. Instead, there was a quiet humility in his eyes. "Dad," he began, his voice low, "can I come in?" Walter nodded and gestured to the empty chair beside him. They sat in silence for a while, the air heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Jason spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about compassion." His hands fidgeted as if the words were too heavy to carry. "When you refused to help me with that loan, I was furious. But now, I get it. I had no right to expect your support when I couldn't even show basic human decency to someone you love." Walter listened quietly, letting his son finish without interruption. Jason's voice cracked when he continued. "I said terrible things to Linda, things I can't take back. But I need you to know I'm ashamed of it." Walter looked at him for a long moment before nodding toward the door. "She's inside," he said softly. Jason hesitated, then stood and walked in. Walter stayed seated, giving them space, listening to the faint murmur of voices inside. Linda was sitting in the living room when Jason appeared. She looked surprised but didn't turn away. "Linda," he began, his voice trembling, "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want you to know I'm sorry for everything I said and for not seeing the person you are." Linda studied him for a moment before smiling gently. "Jason, you hurt me deeply, but I believe people can change, and I want to believe you will." They spoke for a while, their voices growing warmer with each exchange. Walter eventually stepped inside, finding them sitting together on the couch. Not as friends, not yet, but no longer as enemies. Something in the air felt lighter. For Walter, it was the first time in years that hope didn't feel like wishful thinking, but like a real possibility. Later, the three of them shared dinner. It wasn't perfect. Awkward pauses still lingered, but there was laughter too. Small at first, then more genuine. Jason asked about Linda's health, and she told him about her remission. "I'm glad," he said simply. And though the words were few, they carried weight. It was the acknowledgement Walter had longed to hear. As the evening came to an end, Jason stood at the door. "Dad," he said, "you were right. Money can build things, but it can't build character. I understand that now." Walter placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Good," he replied, "because compassion and dignity will take you farther than any bank loan ever could." Jason nodded, his eyes glistening in the porch light. After Jason left, Walter and Linda sat together again on the porch. "Do you think he's really changed?" Linda asked. Walter looked at the stars, thoughtful. "I think he's starting to, and that's enough for now." They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that comes when the hardest battles have been fought and survived. Walter knew the lesson had not only been for Jason, it had been for him too. That love, when paired with firmness, could be the greatest act of care. That respect had to be earned, even within family. And as he held Linda's hand, he understood something deeper. The true wealth in life wasn't in possessions or status, but in the people who walked beside you, willing to grow, change, and love. That was the final lesson, and one they would all carry forever.